A single event with a price tag of nearly $300 billion. A natural disaster so completed displaces 7.2 million people and registers 86,000 casualties. This is not a hurricane. It is not a wildfire. It is not a hypothetical. It is the official consensus projection for what happens when a 150-mile-long crack in the North American continent finally gives way. And it has nothing to do with California. Right now, buried under 200 feet of soft river sediment, a complex of faults known as the New Madrid Seismic Zone sits directly beneath the American heartland, a geological anomaly that most Americans have never heard of. But the federal government has, FEMA has, and they know that when it ruptures, it will not be a local story, not an isolated event. It will be a continental catastrophe. So they modeled the single worst-case scenario, a magnitude 7.7 rupture at 2:00 a.m. And the numbers that came back were staggering, not just damage. Annihilation, the plan for this is not about recovery. It is about survival. Because the engineers and the geologists understand something that millions of people living on top of the fault do not. The shaking is only the beginning. The real problem is what happens next. The question is not whether the plan is good enough. The question is whether any plan could ever be enough for a disaster of this scale. The danger is not theoretical. It has a name. 6 of them. Memphis, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri, Little Rock, Arkansas, Evansville, Indiana, Paducah, Kentucky, and Jonesboro, Arkansas. 6 cities sitting in the crosshairs of a geological time bomb. They are the centers of commerce, medicine, and life for millions of people who assume the ground beneath their feet is stable. It is not stable. It never was. The physics of this zone are fundamentally different from any other fault in North America. California's earthquakes happen on a plate boundary where fractured. Broken rock absorbs seismic energy like a sponge. It's violent, but contained. The New Madrid Zone is the opposite. It sits in the middle of a plate, on bedrock that is ancient, cold, dense, and brutally efficient at transmitting energy. An earthquake here doesn't just shake the ground, it rings it. Like a bell. A 7.0 magnitude quake in the central U.S. doesn't just travel further than one in California. It travels up to 20 times further, expanding the damage zone from a city to a multi-state region. So, a rupture beneath the tiny town of New Madrid, Missouri, population 2,700, doesn't just threaten New Madrid. It projects its catastrophic force across 8 states, directly into the foundations of cities hundreds of miles away. Memphis is the first to fall. It sits directly on top of the soft, unconsolidated sediment of the Mississippi River floodplain. When the shaking starts, that soil will do something terrifying: liquefaction. The ground itself will temporarily turn into a liquid like quicksand. Unreinforced brick buildings, the historic core of the city, will not crack. They will collapse. Water mains, gas lines, and sewer pipes will not just break. They will be sheared in two. In St. Louis, the bridges that connect a metropolis become death traps. In Little Rock, hospitals built decades before modern seismic codes are rendered useless at the exact moment they are needed most. The damage ripples outward, a shockwave of collapsing infrastructure rolling across the heartland. This is not just a problem for these 6 cities. It is a problem for the entire country. And the fault has done it before. It was 2:15 and on December 16, 1811, the American frontier was dark, cold, and quiet. Then the world ended. The first of 3 massive earthquakes erupted from the ground near modern-day Blytheville, Arkansas, an estimated magnitude 7. 7 convulsions so violent it was felt over 1 million square miles. In Washington, D.C., President James Madison and the First Lady were jolted awake by the shaking. In Charleston, South Carolina, sidewalks cracked. Far to the north, in Boston, church bells began ringing on their own, moved by a force 1,000 miles away. Along the Mississippi River, the epicenter was a scene of almost biblical destruction. The ground rose and fell in waves, snapping trees like twigs. Deep fissures opened in the earth, swallowing acres of farmland. The air filled with the roar of the earthquake and the smell of sulfur. For the few settlers living there, it was an experience beyond comprehension. a power that did not belong to this world. Then, on January 23rd, 1812, it happened again, a second 7.5 magnitude shock. And then the third, and most violent, on February 7th, 1812, this one, centered directly near the town of New Madrid, was the one that broke reality. Eyewitnesses described the ground itself rolling. A thrust fault violently uplifted the riverbed, creating waterfalls in the middle of the Mississippi where none had existed moments before. An upheaval so powerful, it forced the most dominant river on the continent to flow backward for several hours, overwhelming islands and creating a permanent 18,000-acre lake in northwest Tennessee where there had only been forest. Reelfoot Lake, a landmark born from pure geological violence. Because the region was so sparsely populated, the death toll was incredibly low. It was registered as a historical curiosity, a freak event on the edge of civilization. But the Earth remembers. Geologists can see the scars left on the landscape. The sand blows, the sunken lands, the warped trees, evidence of a power that has been dormant for 200 years. But not dead. And the civilization that has grown on top of those scars is larger, more complex, and infinitely more fragile than anyone in 1812 could have ever imagined. The next time the river flows backward, it will take millions of lives with it. For a century, the memory of 1812 faded into folklore, a frontier tall tale, the last major convulsion on the fault, a 7 magnitude quake near Charleston, Missouri, on Halloween of 1895, served as a potent reminder. It toppled chimneys, damaged buildings across 23 states, and was felt as far away as Pittsburgh and New Orleans. But then, relative quiet. Decades passed. Cities grew. And the fault became something people in the Midwest talked about in the past tense. Then came the science. Geologists and seismologists began to understand the true nature of the zone. They uncovered the Reelfoot Rift, a 750-million-year-old scar where the continent tried to tear itself apart and failed, leaving a permanent zone of weakness deep in the crust. They used paleoseismology, studying soil layers and ancient sand blows, to build a timeline of past superquakes. They discovered a pattern, a terrifyingly regular one. Massive ruptures seemed to occur on the inmes roughly every 500 years. The last one was in 1812. The clock was ticking. So, in October of 2009, FEMA and the Mid-America Earthquake Center, led by Dr. Amr S. El-Nashai, published the result of a landmark study. They took the historical accounts of 1812, combined them with modern geological data and population maps, and built a comprehensive model of what would happen if a 7.7 magnitude quake struck the inmes today. The report became the baseline for all modern disaster planning. It was not a worst-case scenario. It was a blueprint for doomsday. The document reads like the script of a disaster film. 715,000 damaged buildings, 2.6 million households without electricity, the immediate collapse of hundreds of bridges, severing transportation across the Mississippi River. The May Center report estimated 3,500 fatalities and a total of 86,000 casualties when factoring in injuries. A human toll that would overwhelm every hospital in a 200-mile radius. But the numbers that drew the most attention were the economic ones. A direct economic loss of nearly $300 billion. It would be, without question, the single most expensive natural disaster in the history of the United States. And here's what they didn't focus on in the press releases. The simulation was run for a quake at 2:00 a.m., when most people are at home and relatively safer wood frame houses. If the same quake hits at 2 p.m. on a weekday, when downtowns are full, offices are occupied, and schools are in session, the casualty numbers would be exponentially higher. The report was the version of the story they could stomach telling the public. The reality was likely much worse. The projections were so severe, and the planning so urgent, that it created a new kind of threat. The threat of fear itself. In 1990, a business consultant and self-proclaimed climatologist named Iben Browning looked at the patterns. He saw a confluence of tidal forces and geological stress, and he made a prediction. A 50-50 chance of a catastrophic, magnitude 7. 0 or greater earthquake on the New Madrid Fault on or around December 3, 1990. He was not a seismologist. He had no formal training in geology. He was, by all scientific standards, a crank. But the media didn't care. They had a compelling character and a terrifying story. National news outlets descended on the small towns of the Midwest. The story went viral in a pre-internet age. The fear was palpable, and it was contagious. People bought earthquake insurance. They stockpiled food and water. They planned evacuation routes. As the date approached, the panic escalated. School districts across 5 states, listening to the fears of parents rather than the assurances of scientists, canceled classes for December 3rd and 4th. December 3rd, 1990 arrived. The world held its breath. Nothing happened. The day passed with no earthquake. Ivan Browning's prediction was a complete and total failure. But the event was not without consequence. It was an accidental, real-world experiment in what happens when the idea of this earthquake takes hold. It showed how quickly order could break down, how easily misinformation could hijack public safety, and it revealed a deep, primal fear buried in the region's psyche. The Browning panic was a joke to outsiders, but for the people who lived through it, it was a dress rehearsal for an apocalypse that they, on some level, believed was inevitable. The real earthquake never came. But the panic was very real. And the fault, indifferent to human timelines, just kept waiting. Then, just as the fear from the May Center report became institutionalized, a new and profoundly unsettling idea began to emerge from the scientific community. A theory that questioned everything. The central assumption of the 500-year recurrence cycle was based on geological history. But what if the fault was no longer following its own history? Dr. Seth Stein, a geophysicist at Northwestern University, began deploying hypersensitive GPS monitoring stations all across the New Madrid Zone. For nearly 2 decades, his equipment listened for the one thing that has to be present for a major earthquake to be imminent: strain. Tectonic plates move, grinding against each other, building up stress in the rock that must eventually be released. You can measure that movement. In California, along the San Andreas Fault, scientists measure strain accumulating at a rate of several millimeters per year. You can see the ground deforming. You can watch the clock ticking. So, Dr. Stein's team watched the New Madrid. And they saw nothing. The rate of ground deformation was less than 0.2 millimeters per year. A rate so slow, it was statistically almost zero. The fault was not accumulating stress. The plates were not grinding. The spring was not being coiled. After years of meticulous measurement, Stein proposed a radical new theory. The New Madrid Seismic Zone was dying. In his view, the thousands of small tremors the USCS records each year are not a sign of a coming catastrophe. They are the opposite. They are the fault settling down. Long-term aftershocks from the massive rupture in 1812, like a giant machine powering down after one last, violent effort. This is not a fringe idea. It's a fierce, ongoing scientific debate. On one side, you have the USCS and FEMA. Their models are based on the geological past. The 500-year cycle is real. The history is written in the soil. The threat is still there, and the probability of a magnitude 7.0 or greater quake in the next 50 years stands at 7 to 10%, a risk that no responsible government can ignore. On the other side, you have Seth Stein and a growing number of geophysicists pointing to the real-time GPS data. The past is the past, they argue. The fault was active for a few thousand years, and now that period of activity might be over. The continent's stress has moved elsewhere. To base a $300 billion disaster plan on a fault that is effectively shut down is, in their view, a colossal misallocation of resources and public fear. So who do you believe? The historians reading the scars of the Earth, or the technicians reading the live data from the satellites? Is the monster in the basement asleep, or is it dead? This isn't an academic question. The answer determines whether Memphis needs to spend billions retrofitting every brick building. It determines whether a homeowner in Paducah needs to buy earthquake insurance, It determines whether the entire central United States is living next to a ticking time bomb or just a ghost story. Both cannot be right. And in June of 2026, the ground offered a new, ambiguous clue. Between June 14th and 17th, a swarm of microquakes rattled the fault line, a magnitude 2.2 under the Mississippi River in Tennessee. Multiple smaller tremors in New Madrid County, Missouri. To the USGs, it was a predictable rumble from an active fault. To supporters of Stein's theory, it was the sound of a dying fire, popping and crackling as its last embers go cold. The most catastrophic consequence of a New Madrid rupture is not the shaking itself, it's the cascade failure. The scenario planners at FEMA call it a black swan event, because the interconnected collapse is so total, no single agency can handle it. The problem is logistics. Memphis is not just a city. It is America's distribution hub, the home of the FedEx global headquarters, the super hub that processes millions of packages every single night. It is a critical node for railroads and river barges. It is the logistical heart of the country. The May Center report projects that in the event of a 7.7 quake, every major highway bridge crossing the Mississippi in the impact zone will either collapse or be rendered unsafe for use. 100% failure. Let that sink in. The country is effectively cut in half. No trucks can get across. No fuel, no food, no medical supplies. The FedEx Superhub is not just damaged, it's on an island of impassable roads and shattered runways. The national supply chain does not just slow down, it stops. This creates a secondary crisis almost immediately. Millions of displaced people will need food, water, and shelter. But the supplies they need are on the other side of a river that can no longer be crossed. The rescue personnel they need are stuck in 200-mile traffic jams. The economic ripple effect begins instantly. A factory in Ohio shuts down because the parts it needs are stuck in a rail yard in Arkansas. A hospital in Florida runs out of a critical drug because the FedEx plane that was supposed to deliver it can no longer take off from Memphis. This is the scenario that keeps generals at the Pentagon awake at night. Not the earthquake, but the paralysis. An event that doesn't just destroy a region, but cripples the nation's ability to respond, to function, to even move. The 755,000 damaged buildings are a tragedy. The 86,000 casualties are a nightmare. But the logistical blackout is what transforms a regional disaster into a national security crisis. It's what makes the New Madrid fault so much more dangerous than the San Andreas. An earthquake in Los Angeles is a catastrophe for Los Angeles. An earthquake in New Madrid is a catastrophe for everyone. The quiet, insidious threat lurking beneath the headline numbers is liquefaction's effect on buried infrastructure. The 6 cities in the primary danger zone all rely on networks of pipes for water, sanitation, and natural gas. These networks were built over decades, a complex web of iron, steel, and concrete. In liquefied soil, these pipes don't just crack, they float. They are crushed, sheared, and twisted. The result is a city that is simultaneously on fire and without water. Hundreds of natural gas line breaks create uncontrollable fires that firefighters cannot reach because the roads have collapsed, and even if they could, the fire hydrants have no pressure. At the same time, the water supply is instantly contaminated. Broken sewer lines mix with broken water mains, creating a toxic sludge that can spread disease with terrifying speed. For the survivors of the initial quake, the secondary threats of fire and plague become the real challenge. How do you shelter 2 million people who have no power, no clean water, and no sanitation? The answer from the official reports is chillingly simple. You don't. Not effectively. Not in the first few weeks. The system is designed to break. This leads to the most uncomfortable part of the entire discussion. The science is debated. The economic cost is astronomical. But the ground is still moving. The USG states the probability of a magnitude 6.0 or greater earthquake in the NIS within the next 50 years is between 25 and 40%. Not a certainty, but far from a ghost story. It's a roll of the dice with an entire region's future. And so the disconnect remains. Millions of people live their lives, work their jobs, and raise their families on top of one of the most significant seismic hazards in the country, and most are completely unaware. They see tornado drills and flood warnings. They don't see the silent, accumulating risk buried 200 feet down. The 6 cities are not just names on a list. They are ecosystems of infrastructure, culture, and human life built on a foundation that science tells us is fundamentally unstable, or potentially already dead. That uncertainty is the real terror of the New Madrid Fault, the feeling that the worst day in American history might have already happened 200 years ago, or it might be scheduled for tomorrow morning. And there is absolutely no way to know which it is until the